1941, December 7, Pearl Harbor, Oahu, Hawaii. This is a first-person war story set in the Pacific Theater, 1941, at Pearl Harbor, Oahu, Hawaii, following a naval enlisted man aboard a battleship on Battleship Row, one of three voices caught inside the most consequential morning in American military history. You'll live through a warning that was heard and buried, a sky that broke open without mercy, and a harbor that turned to fire while men tried to remember how to fight back. But the moment that decides everything is not the first bomb, it's the phone call that was ended 3 minutes before the planes arrived. The coffee was weak. That was the first thing. The coffee, thin as harbor water and barely warm, sloshing in a tin cup I was holding over the side rail of the USS West Virginia with the careless ease of a man who had done exactly this every Sunday morning for 4 months and expected to do it 4 months more. A Sunday luxury. The galley crew had cut corners because nobody was checking, because the watch was light and the officers were either at services or still asleep, and I didn't mind. Weak coffee on a warm December morning in Hawaii was still better than strong coffee anywhere else I'd been in my 22 years of living, better than the mess at boot camp, better than the diner in Norfolk where they charged 40 cents for something that tasted like burned bark, better than whatever my father brewed on winter mornings in Pennsylvania in that chipped enamel pot he refused to replace. I held the cup over the rail and watched the harbor wake up. The harbor smelled the way it always did on mornings like this. Salt and diesel and something faintly sweet blowing down off the mountains, like the land was exhaling after the night, and beneath all of it a mineral undertone from the sea that you stopped noticing after the first few weeks, but that came back to your attention on quiet mornings when everything else was still. It was the kind of smell that convinces a man everything is fine. Everything was fine. We'd been at Condition 3 for weeks, a reduced watch, peacetime readiness by another name, because the brass had looked at the intelligence reports and decided the tension building in the Pacific was a diplomat's problem, not a sailor's. I didn't know what was in those reports. I only knew what I could see, which was water and sky and the other ships of Battleship Row sitting in their neat Sunday stillness like models in a museum diorama, patient and magnificent and entirely at rest. Ford Island lay off our port bow, flat and green and ordinary in the early light. Grass that had been rained on recently was catching the sun at a low angle and throwing it back in the particular bright way wet grass does. A few men from the island station were tossing a football near the hangars, their movements small and unhurried from this distance, their laughter reaching us across the water in fragments. A note, a syllable, a rise of sound that meant something was funny, though I couldn't hear what. Church bells had been ringing from somewhere on shore since about 07:30. The particular round and patient sound of a bell tower I'd never located with my eyes but had come to associate with Sundays, the way I associated other sounds with other days. Reveille with Monday, the supply boat with Thursday, the weekend Liberty whistle with Fridays. I leaned on the rail and let the morning be what it was. Petty Officer Second Class Callum stood beside me, smoking a cigarette he'd bummed from somewhere. He was from rural Georgia, from a county so small it didn't appear on most maps. And he had a way of talking about food, specifically about his mother's cooking, that elevated the subject to something approaching philosophy. Right now, he was describing biscuits. Not just any biscuits. The biscuits she made on the second Sunday of every month when she used the good flour, the kind she kept in a separate canister on the top shelf, and rendered her own lard rather than using what came in the tin from the store. He described the texture in terms I hadn't heard applied to food before. Architectural, he said. They had structural integrity. You could break them apart and they'd hold their shape until you applied deliberate pressure, which was apparently the test of a proper biscuit. I was half listening. The sun was getting itself up properly now, clearing the edge of the mountains and beginning to do real work on the harbor. The light was in that early morning state of not quite committing to its own warmth, present, growing, but still thin, still touched at the edges with something cool and blue. The sky above was the particular shade you only see in those minutes after sunrise clears the horizon, but before the full heat of the day bleaches everything to a harsher register. I found it restful. I found most of Hawaii restful, in the mild and specific way that places you've grown accustomed to become restful, not because they're inherently peaceful, but because you've stopped having to think about them. I knew where everything was. I knew the rhythms. I knew when the mail came, and when the supply runs happened, and what the cook was likely to attempt on Tuesday nights. I knew nothing about what was already in the air, north of the island, beyond the haze at the horizon's edge, somewhere to the north of us, much further than I could see, beyond the cloud layer that had been sitting over the mountains since early morning. The first wave of aircraft had already turned south. I didn't know that. I was thinking about biscuits and weak coffee and whether Liberty that afternoon would be worth the ferry ride to Honolulu. Then the sound changed. It's hard to describe because it happened in stages. The way a change in weather announces itself, not with a single obvious shift, but through a series of small wrongnesses that accumulate until the wrongness is too large to dismiss. First there was a hum, low, distant, more felt in the chest than heard with the ears, continuous in the way that a natural sound is never continuous. Nature is irregular. Engines are not. This was an engine sound, or many engine sounds, layered until they blurred into a single presence, and it was coming from the north and it was growing. Callum stopped talking. The biscuit detail suspended itself in midair between us, unresolved. The football players on Ford Island stopped throwing. The ball arced down into the grass, and nobody moved to pick it up. Every man on the deck of the West Virginia had gone quiet at the same moment, which was how I knew this wasn't inside my own head, wasn't some echo off the mountains, wasn't the B-17s from the mainland that everyone always said were always coming. You knew something was wrong because the people around you knew it at the same instant, and there's a mathematics to that kind of collective recognition that overrides individual doubt. I looked north. The sky was no longer empty. There were shapes in it, many shapes, flying low, far too low for any peacetime flight path, skimming toward us over the water at a speed that belonged to a different kind of morning. I watched them come for a second that felt much longer, my brain performing its own inventory. Aircraft, formation, low altitude, closing, direction, and then the light caught the wings and I saw the markings on the nearest plane. A red circle, brilliant and stark against the silver-gray metal, centered on the wing surface with the clean geometry of something intentional and total. One aircraft broke from the formation and screamed over the Ford Island seaplane ramp at no more than 30 feet above the water. I could see the rivet lines on the fuselage. I could see the shape of the canopy, and the dark shape of a head inside it. The sound it made wasn't the sound of a passing aircraft. It was a tearing, a ripping of the air that you felt as pressure against your face and chest, a physical violence without contact. Then the first explosion. It came from the direction of the seaplane hangars, a billow of black smoke, then orange, then a sound like the world had been struck by something too large to see, a concussive crack that arrived through the hull of the ship before it arrived through the air. And that distinction matters because it meant I felt the West Virginia shake beneath my feet before the sound reached my ears. Steel and bone conducted the same event. The shockwave came and went, and in its wake there was a half-second of complete silence that was more frightening than the explosion itself. Then everything happened at once. The second explosion. Callum shouting something. The alarm. Men running on the deck in the wrong shoes for running. The tin cup leaving my hand. I don't remember releasing it. Don't remember the sound of it hitting the deck, only the subsequent memory of looking down at my empty hand and finding the absence meaningful. The sky above the harbor was changing. The blue was going somewhere. In its place came the first gray edge of smoke, and the sound of more engines, and the understanding that the morning was not going to be what it had been when I picked up that coffee cup. This wasn't an accident. The sky had teeth. 6 miles north and 93 minutes earlier, Private Joseph Lockard was sitting in front of a radar screen at the Opana Mobile radar station on the northern tip of Oahu, and what he was looking at did not make sense within any framework the morning had prepared him for. The radar equipment was old. They were always old up here, assigned from surplus stocks to a station that nobody at Fort Shafter apparently considered critical, running on a generator that required a specific combination of coaxing and profanity to start on cold mornings. The oscilloscopes were temperamental. The sweep was sometimes inconsistent. Lockard had trained himself to read the machine's quirks the way a mechanic learns to read an engine, the normal sounds of abnormality, the baseline noise within which genuine anomalies had to be found. He knew what a ghost return looked like on this equipment. He knew what weather clutter looked like, what a single aircraft looked like, what the usual commercial traffic from the mainland looked like when it was close enough to appear. What he was looking at did not look like any of those things. The return was massive, his word, used later, and accurate. It occupied a section of the scope with a density and solidity that the equipment produced only when there was a very large number of objects in a relatively small volume of sky. Lockard had seen nothing like it in his weeks at the station. He ran the bearing twice. He ran the range twice. The math came back the same both times. Approximately 130 miles to the north, closing at an estimated 180 miles per hour, bearing consistent with an approach to Oahu from the direction of the open Pacific. 200 aircraft, possibly more. He reached for the telephone. The Aircraft Warning Service Information Center at Fort Shafter had a duty officer on at that hour, a lieutenant who had been awake since well before dawn, who had processed the usual overnight traffic and was now working through the administrative tail end of his shift. The scheduled radar operation hours had technically ended at 0700. Lockhart and his partner Elliot had kept the equipment running only because they were waiting for a transport truck that was supposed to take them back to Wahiawa, and running the radar while they waited had seemed like a reasonable use of the time. The fact that it was still operating was an accident of a truck being late. Lockhart explained what he was seeing. He kept his voice level, which required effort, because the number on the scope was large enough that keeping his voice level felt somewhat dishonest. The lieutenant considered for a moment. A flight of B-17 Flying Fortresses was expected from the mainland. Everyone knew this. It had been on the operations board for days. The radar return from a dozen B-17s at certain distances could sometimes produce a larger than expected scope return, depending on atmospheric conditions and the angle of approach. "It's probably the B-17s," the lieutenant said. "Don't worry about it." Lockhart said the bearing was wrong for the B-17 approach corridor. He said the return was too dense for 12 heavy bombers. He said the aircraft speed was inconsistent with B-17s on a ferry flight. The lieutenant said it was probably still the B-17s. He said there was nothing to worry about. The line clicked. A sound like absolute domestic finality. A telephone call ended in the middle of the morning. A conversation concluded. A concern filed and disposed of in the time it takes to press a disconnect bar. Lockhart held the receiver for a moment. Then he set it down. He stared at the screen. The blip was closer. It had been approximately 130 miles when he'd called. It was perhaps 110 miles now. Moving, he tried the line again and got a busy signal that went on long enough to confirm there was no immediate intention to reconnect. He looked at Elliot, who had been watching the whole thing from across the small room with the expression of someone who has just witnessed a decision that doesn't seem right, but who doesn't have the authority to say so out loud. What Lockhart did next was what training allowed him to do. He documented the contact. Time, bearing, range, estimated number of aircraft. He wrote it in the station log, with a care that in retrospect looks like a man creating a record of what he tried to do, like a soldier who knows he can't win the engagement, but needs the engagement to have been conducted correctly regardless. Outside the radar station, the morning was beautiful in the specific way that early mornings are beautiful in Hawaii. The lights still low and gold, the hills above Opana green from the recent rain. The air with that washed clean quality that follows a night of moisture and emerges at dawn before the heat of the day reasserts itself. A myna bird was working through its repertoire somewhere in the brush below the station, the mechanical, varied calls of a bird that learns from everything around it, cycling through its collection of borrowed sounds with professional steadiness. Elliot poured what was left in the thermos into a cup and passed it to Lockhart without comment. Lockhart took it without comment. They watched the scope together. The blip was at 90 miles when they felt the first distant tremor of the explosions carried through the ground of the island from the south. Lockhart noted the time. He noted that the blip had arrived at the island in exactly the time the radar suggested it would, at exactly the speed he had reported, from exactly the bearing he had reported. He did not say, "I told you so." There was no one to say it to, and it would not have helped anything. Down on the harbor, 6 miles south through the mountain spine of the island, the church bells had stopped. In their place, something that sounded like the end of a world. "We had a few minutes," Lockhart would say much later. "We spent them on disbelief. By the time I reached the anti-aircraft station on the West Virginia's forward deck, the first torpedo was already in the water, and I saw it, actually saw it, which not many men who were there could say afterward. I had been moving toward the gun position from the moment the alarm sounded, crossing the deck in the confused fast walk that isn't quite a run because the mind hasn't yet authorized full emergency speed, still partly insisting that there's some version of events in which this is a drill or a mistake. The brain is very reluctant to revise its expectations in real time. It fights the revision. It wants the familiar interpretation to be correct for a few additional seconds, even as the evidence against the familiar interpretation is piling up at a rate the familiar interpretation cannot survive. I was looking in the right direction when the Kate torpedo bomber leveled off. 20 feet above the harbor surface, maybe less. The pilot had dropped to an altitude that was itself a feat of flying, a demonstration of training and commitment that I have had to work to remain honest about, because it was both impressive and being done with the specific intention of killing me and everyone near me. The aircraft was perfectly level. The release happened with a clinical cleanness. The torpedo left the belly of the plane and entered the water in a shallow angle, and I watched the white trail of its passage beneath the surface the way a man watches a car slide off a rain-soaked road, present, aware, and precisely unable to intervene. The torpedo hit the West Virginia amidships on the port side. The sound is the thing I've most tried to describe over the decades that followed, and every description falls short by the same margin. The experience and the language don't scale. What I can say is that it was not recognizably an explosion in the form that word implies. It was a conversion, a sudden total transformation of the structural integrity of the ship into force, the hull receiving the impact and distributing it through every connecting element simultaneously. The ship didn't shake, it lurched. That's the word, and it's still not quite right. Something enormous seized the West Virginia at the waterline and transmitted its verdict through 30,000 tons of steel in a single comprehensive moment. I was thrown against the splinter shield, hard enough to open a gash above my right ear. I was aware of the blood before I processed the pain, which is the order in which those things arrive when the body is operating in a state of shock, sensation, warm and immediate, before the evaluation of the sensation. My hands found the shield and held it. My feet sorted themselves beneath me. The deck was trembling in a new continuous way, a deep and ongoing vibration that was the ship telling me something fundamental had changed in its relationship with the water. The noise was its own environment. It wasn't a collection of separate sounds that could be sorted and identified. It was a medium, like smoke, that everything happened within, the metallic tearing of ruptured compartments, the screaming release of steam from pipes that the blast had broken somewhere below, the overlapping shouts of orders from every direction, damage control, general quarters, get the ammunition, someone get the lieutenant, dissolving into each other before any of them could be acted on. And through all of it, from somewhere on the fantail, the sharp and incongruous chatter of a .40 caliber machine gun that someone had gotten to and was firing upward into the aircraft passing overhead in a fury of activity that might or might not be hitting anything but was at least a declaration. The aircraft were everywhere. The sky over the harbor had become a machinery of organized violence, torpedo bombers approaching from the southeast in precise measured runs, dive bombers above them releasing from altitude in the steep angle that their name describes, Zero fighters strafing anything on the surface that showed signs of resistance. The Zeros were the surprise. They were faster than anything we'd been told to expect from Japanese aircraft, faster and more maneuverable, with a pilot quality that was also better than the assessments had suggested, which was information we were learning in the most expensive possible way. I found Petty Officer Second Class Dawes at the forward 1.1-inch gun mount. He was already working the latches on the ready box, and the ready box wasn't opening. And the reason it wasn't opening was that it was locked. Locked because this was Sunday, because Condition 3 did not require ammunition at the ready, because no one who had set up this system had seriously modeled the scenario in which the ammunition needed to be accessed on a Sunday morning in December in Hawaii without warning or preparation time. Key, Dawes said. Not requesting, not asking, accounting. Determining the state of the resource and finding it absent. The officer of the deck would have the key. The officer of the deck was somewhere in the chaos between the forward gun mount and the bridge, which was a distance that had been about 40 feet of walkable deck before the attack began and was now 40 feet of smoke and running men, and a hull that was increasingly not level. I didn't have the key. I started thinking about what else I had. Dawes had already moved to the tool rack on the bulkhead. He took down the fire axe, a solid thing, double-headed, mounted in a bracket that he stripped with one motion, and he brought it back to the ready box with the particular economy of a man who has stopped deliberating and moved into execution. 3 blows, the lock deformed on the second, and failed on the third, and Dawes had the box open before the metal stopped ringing from the impact. The ammunition was there. The ammunition was there, and the gun was intact. And the moment we got the feed loaded and the gun elevated and tracking, something that had been pure reaction became something with a point. That's the best way to describe it. The transition from being acted upon to acting, even in the smallest and most inadequate way, has a specific quality to it that I can't fully characterize, except to say that it's the difference between being inside a fire and having a bucket. A torpedo bomber came in on a parallel run about 300 yards to our port. I could see it clearly, the red markings, the intake geometry of the engine, the steady and resolved approach of a pilot who knew he wasn't going to be shot down on this run because the targets weren't shooting yet. The aircraft was so close that I could see the slight adjustment of the control surfaces as the pilot made his final alignment correction. The torpedo entered the water with the particular white splash that I would learn in the next hour to recognize and dread. The man who had been standing to my left, his name was Henderson, I know that now, hit the deck before I heard the strafing fire that put him there. The sound came afterward, a half-second later, because the bullets were supersonic and the sound was not. He went down sideways and lay with his cheek on the deck plates, his eyes open with an expression that looked absurdly like mild irritation, the face of a man who has been interrupted in the middle of making a point. His right hand was reaching across the deck at an angle, fingers slightly curled as if he'd just dropped something and was about to retrieve it. I did not stop firing. I have thought about that since, in the middle of many nights, and I have come to no settled conclusion about what it means about me. I simply did not stop. We were targets. We had been targets from the beginning of the morning. We just didn't know it yet. The ship was flooding. That was the fact that existed underneath everything else. Underneath the fire and the noise and the men and the orders and the acrid dark smoke that was beginning to colonize the air above the deck, the fundamental and inescapable physical truth that the USS West Virginia was taking on water faster than any collection of human hands could oppose. The second torpedo hit came approximately 70 seconds after the first. The third followed the second by 90 seconds. Both were port side, both below the armored belt, both punching through into compartments that began filling immediately. The ship's list started gradually. Not the dramatic roll of a vessel in distress as I had imagined it from training films, not a rapid and cinematic tipping, but a slow and relentless inclination, an incremental departure from the horizontal that you detected first through your feet, through the body's automatic and very accurate sense of what level is before you could confirm it with your eyes. The deck was no longer level. Walking toward the stern required a degree of effort that hadn't been there before, a compensation that the legs made without being asked. The horizon line, visible through the gun ports on the port side, was wrong, displaced upward from where a horizon was supposed to be, which meant we were tilting toward it, which meant the port side was going down. I went below on the orders of a lieutenant whose name I never learned, and whose face I can still reproduce in complete detail, gaunt, close-shaved, with the specific stillness of a man who has accepted the situation fully and is now operating within it rather than reacting to it. He pointed to the deck hatch, told me compartments C and D, told me anyone who could walk under their own power and anyone I could carry, and turned back to the damage control board before the word "sir" had fully left my mouth. Below decks was a different war. The above-deck war was noise and motion, and the terrible clarity that open sky and daylight provide. You could see what was happening to you, which was horrifying but at least located. Below was the inverse of that. The emergency lamps had failed in 2 out of 3 compartments I passed through, replaced by the red battle lanterns that turned everything into a fever dream of crimson shadow and deep contrast. The smoke was worse down here, thicker, moving along the overhead rather than dispersing, finding the low points of the spaces and beginning to fill them from the top down. The sound was different too. The explosions from outside arrived as deep structural thuds that you felt through the soles of your feet and in the bones of your jaw before your ears registered anything, the steel conducting the shockwaves in ways the air couldn't replicate. The ship was telling you what was happening to it through your skeleton. The water announced itself before I saw it. It came first through my boots, a coldness, a slight give in the deck surface that wasn't structural but gravitational, water moving across a surface under something's pressure, and then I saw it in the red lamplight, gleaming on the deck plates like something alive, moving with a slow purposefulness toward the lowest point of each compartment, patient and entirely indifferent to anything I might think about it. I found 2 men in compartment C who could move, a machinist's mate who had taken shrapnel across the back of his hands but could still use them, and a seaman first class who was unhurt but whose eyes had the specific unfocused quality of a man whose nervous system is trying to reboot itself. I took both of them. Compartment D was through a hatch on the forward bulkhead. The hatch was accessible. I went in. There were no men visible in compartment D. The space was larger than C, with a secondary passage leading forward, and in the red light and the thickening smoke, the far end of the compartment was not clearly visible. I moved through it, checking spaces, and found nothing that could move. I was turning back toward the hatch when I heard the knocking. It came from behind the watertight hatch on the starboard bulkhead, deliberate, repeated, the pattern of a person rather than settling metal. 8 knocks, a pause, 8 more knocks. The rhythm was slowing on the second set, which told me something I didn't want to know about the energy available on the other side of that hatch. I touched the metal. The bulkhead was warm. Not from the sea on the other side. Not from the harbor water that was already at the outer hull in this section. Warm from fire. Something was burning on the far side of the bulkhead, close enough to conduct its heat through the steel. I tried the hatch wheel. It didn't move. The wheel was frozen, the blast had warped the frame geometry, or the heat had expanded the metal enough to jam the mechanism, or both, and what was meant to be a safety system had become the opposite. I leaned into the wheel with both hands, with my shoulder against the spokes, working it through what felt like concrete resistance. The knocking continued, then slowed. A longer pause between repetitions. Machinist's mate Alvarez. I'd found him in sea with his arm broken in 2 places and held against his chest with his good hand, positioned himself beside me without being asked. One good hand on the wheel alongside mine. He was white-faced and breathing in the shallow, controlled way of a man who has organized his relationship with pain into something manageable, and the sound he was making wasn't language, but it wasn't not language either. A kind of running commentary on the effort that didn't stop even when the wheel didn't move. 3 inches. The wheel moved 3 inches and stopped. The heat through the bulkhead was increasing. I could feel it through my palms now, through the metal of the wheel itself, a warmth that was moving toward something more serious. Alvarez made the sound again. I made whatever sound I was making. The wheel stopped. The knocking stopped. It simply stopped. The rhythm reached the end of what it had available and did not resume. I held the wheel for another few seconds. The hot metal, the red light, the smoke now low enough to make me cough. Alvarez said, with the flat practicality of a man who has fully processed the situation and arrived at the only remaining option. We have to go. I let go of the wheel. We went. The water at the base of the ladder was 6 inches higher than it had been when we came down. Above decks, the Arizona moored ahead of us on Battleship Row was gone in the way that defies the word gone. She was still there, her wreckage still present in the harbor, but a bomb had found her forward magazine at approximately 08 sen, and what followed was not an explosion in any ordinary meaning of that term. It was an event that the men who witnessed it from a distance initially couldn't categorize. A fireball that rose high enough to be seen from across the island, a shockwave powerful enough to kill men on adjacent vessels through concussive force alone, before a piece of metal or a flame touched them. The Arizona had transitioned from a ship into a fact in approximately 10 seconds. The oil from her ruptured fuel tanks had spread across the harbor surface and caught, and the men who had survived the initial explosion and gone into the water were now in a harbor that was burning around them. The water was on fire. The smoke column from the Arizona was already so large that it had begun to affect the light quality over the entire harbor, dimming the morning into something false and orange, a daylight that wasn't the color of day. The harbor had turned into a furnace. The water had turned into oil. The oil had turned into fire. The fire was now teaching everything near it what heat truly meant. I couldn't stop hearing the knocking that had stopped. Corporal David Ramos at Hickam Field had been awake for precisely 43 minutes when the first strafing run arrived. He was in transit from the barracks to the mess hall, thinking about eggs, specifically about whether the powdered eggs would be reconstituted correctly, or whether whoever was on kitchen duty this Sunday had eyeballed the ratio again, which always produced something too wet and vaguely yellow in a way that made you feel judged for eating it. He was weighing this against the alternative, which was skipping eggs and filling up on whatever bread was available, when the sound from the north reached him. He stopped walking. The mind registered wrong before it registered what was wrong. Wrong pitch for any aircraft he could place. Too many engines, too low, too fast for an approach pattern, and coming from a direction that no aircraft should be approaching from at this hour. He looked north, past the hangars, toward the mountains. The aircraft came over the ridgeline in the particular formation of the first wave's fighter component, the Zeros assigned to suppress airfield resistance before the bombers arrived. They had looped south after their initial run on the harbor and were coming back for the fields. They came in low and fast with the sun behind them, which was tactical elegance, so complete it functioned as a kind of insult. They had thought about where the sun would be at this hour and had used it. The first strafing run across the Hickam tarmac was approximately 14 seconds long. In those 14 seconds, the aircraft parked in neat wing-to-wing rows on the field, arrayed in that configuration as a precaution against sabotage from the ground, which was the threat the security posture had been designed to address. Received the strafing fire in sequence, one aircraft to the next, the machine gun fire moving down the line with a progression that was mechanical and absolute. Propellers, engines, fuel tanks, cockpits, The sound of the bullets was not a single crack but a sustained tearing, a long wet rip through aluminum and glass and rubber, and what had been a functional airfield 20 minutes ago was in the process of becoming something else entirely. Ramos ran. He ran sideways, not away toward the revetment wall on the north side, because his body had made a decision before his brain formalized it, which was that horizontal cover was the only relevant category in the next several seconds. He tripped on a fuel hose that someone had left lying across the tarmac, not coiled, not stowed, just left there in the casual way that happens when there's no expectation of needing to run, and went down hard on his hands and knees on the concrete. The concrete was warm from the morning sun. His palms took the impact and bled immediately, the skin opening at the heel of each hand in matching small gashes that he didn't register as pain yet, because the adrenaline was doing what adrenaline does. He got up. He kept moving. The Zeros were banking for a second pass. The machine gun nest at the northeast corner of the field was unmanned. The crew had been in the mess hall, which was itself now the scene of a different kind of emergency, as bombs began falling on the building, and Ramos reached the position in the time between the first and second strafing runs, which was enough time if you moved without deliberation and didn't think too carefully about what you were running toward. He had trained on this weapon. That training was the most important thing inside his skull at this moment. More important than fear. More important than any assessment of his situation. More important than the calculations about probability of survival that the brain wants to run when it perceives extreme danger. Training is the replacement for deliberation when there's no time for deliberation. It's the thing you practice when you're not in the moment so that when you're in the moment you don't need to think. He got the gun up. He got it elevated and tracking. The second strafing run was incoming from the north. Same bearing, same altitude, same speed. He opened fire. Whether he hit anything on that pass he cannot say with certainty. The Zero was fast and the gun was heavy and his hands were shaking in the fine motor way that adrenaline produces in the body's extremities, without regard for what you want from your hands. But the act of firing, of sending rounds upward into the approach corridor rather than simply receiving what came down, was its own transformation. Ramos described it later as the moment the morning became real to him, by which I think he meant that action converted the abstract horror of being attacked into something that had a response, something that his body had a protocol for. The gun in his hands was a problem he knew how to work. The problem of the morning was still enormous and terrible and running well ahead of his ability to affect it, but the gun at least was a problem the size of his hands. Across the field, something was happening that would become one of the stories of that morning. Two lieutenants, George Welch and Kenneth Taylor, had been awake all night playing poker at Wheeler Field's Officers Club, an all-night session that had wandered into Sunday morning with the specific looseness of men who had decided that sleep was a problem for later. When the attack began, they did not go to shelter. They called the auxiliary airstrip at Halaiwa by field telephone, an argument that Welch later described as brief and emphatic, conducted with someone on the other end who needed convincing that the situation was exactly as extreme as it appeared, and were told their P-40 Warhawks were fueled and ready. They drove to Halaiwa. The road between Wheeler and Halaiwa was not, under ordinary circumstances, a road that rewarded speed. They made it anyway. They reached the airstrip. They climbed in. They took off. In the middle of the attack, with Battleship Row producing its columns of black smoke and Hickam tarmac littered with the aluminum carcasses of what had been a functioning Air Force 40 minutes earlier, two American P-40s pushed through the smoke layer above Oahu and went looking for a fight. They were outnumbered 40-1 to survive. Ramos was still on the machine gun, fingers aching, palms still bleeding, when he saw the P-40s make their first pass on a Japanese formation, the distinctive silhouette of American aircraft, shark-mouthed and aggressive, doing something he hadn't expected to see this morning, which was attacking. He watched 1-0 break off its run and bank hard to evade, and something shifted in the quality of his attention. Not relief, not optimism, nothing as organized as that, but a recognition, a registration of the fact that someone had decided the morning was not finished yet. We were supposed to fight in the air. We trained for it, prepared for it, built our doctrine around it. Instead, on December 7th, we fought for the right to stand on the ground and resist at all. The P-40s were the standing made airborne. The rest of us, on the tarmac and the decks and the docks, were the evidence of what it cost to get there. The second wave arrived at 0854, 167 aircraft, 54 high-level bombers, 78 dive bombers, 35 fighters. By the time they crossed the northern coastline of Oahu, the harbor had been announcing its own position for an hour. The smoke columns from Battleship Row, from the Arizona above everything else, but also from Oklahoma and California, and the Nevada, and the West Virginia, and the cluster of smaller vessels caught in the initial attack, were visible from 40 miles offshore. They rose and merged at altitude into a single enormous darkness, a weather event created by catastrophe, and the aircraft of the second wave navigated by it the way ships navigate by a lighthouse. We had become our own beacon. We were generating the signal that was guiding the next attack toward us. I was on the dock by then, or what remained of a usable dock. The West Virginia had been deliberately flooded on the starboard side through an act of damage control that I was not present for but benefited from, the controlled flooding counteracting the torpedo-induced port list, preventing a complete capsize, settling the ship to the harbor bottom in an upright position with her upper structures above water. It was the right decision, made without proper orders, by men who understood the physics of the situation and acted on that understanding. The ship was on the bottom. The ship was also still the West Virginia rather than a wreck rolled on her side. There were men coming out of the water near the dock, swimmers, some of them from the Arizona, some from Oklahoma which had rolled, some from positions I couldn't determine because the oil was on all of them, and the oil made everyone the same color and the same weight of exhaustion. A battery of 1.1-inch anti-aircraft guns had been set up in a relatively organized state between two warehouses, manned by a crew of 5 who had gotten themselves into a working rhythm, the trainer tracking, the loader feeding without pause, the gunner walking his bursts across the approach angles with the patient and economic adjustment of someone who has accepted that every round needs to count and that wasting ammunition on anger is a luxury they don't have. There was a rhythm to this that hadn't existed at 0755. Something had been learned in the first hour. The problem was that the enemy had also been learning during that hour, learning what our anti-aircraft fire looked like, where the gaps were, which angles of approach were least covered, how to fly through the response rather than avoid it. Medic Sergeant Frank Flores was working behind the gun position. He moved with the specific efficiency of someone who has triaged before. Not moving fast for its own sake, but moving precisely. Each action the result of a prior assessment, no energy spent on anything except the next right action. His kit bag was already more than half depleted. He was applying pressure dressings with the speed of practiced hands and moving on, because moving on was what triage required, not staying with any one man longer than the wound demanded, not letting the care for the individual override the calculation about how many individuals remained. A man I had spoken to in the mess the previous evening was on the concrete behind me. We had spoken about something ordinary, whether liberty in Honolulu on weekday afternoons was worth the ferry ride, something in that register, a conversation that had lasted maybe 3 minutes and resolved nothing particularly important and had belonged to the category of talk that fills in the space between the things that actually matter. I could see his face. I could see his shoulder wound and the pressure bandage that was holding but not fully stopping what it needed to stop. I could reconstruct the conversation, the ferry discussion, the specific inconsequential quality of it. I could not for a few seconds recover his name. The name was there, I knew it was there, had known it yesterday in the mess, but the retrieval mechanism wasn't working at full speed. Shock does this. The filing systems of memory don't operate on their normal schedule when the brain is in emergency mode. Names that are normally instant take a full second longer. Faces that are normally anonymous become hyper-specific. The brain is sorting by different criteria. Flores moved to him. The name came back to me a moment later, which was too late to matter and too late to use. The dive bombers overhead were releasing from altitude now, the bombs coming down through the thickening smoke in a trajectory that had a visible downward arc when you tracked them against the sky, which you only did once, because watching the bomb coming at you from above is information you can't act on and that the body doesn't know what to do with. The anti-aircraft fire was heavier than it had been in the first wave. The harbor had gotten itself organized to a degree, more guns elevated and manned, the response more coherent, but the dive bombers had speed and angle working for them in ways that made coherent defense extremely difficult. The Nevada had gotten underway. That was the morning's one miracle of motion, the only battleship to get her engines running and move, the only ship of Battleship Row to be a moving target rather than a stationary one. She was heading toward the channel entrance when the second wave found her. One bomb, then 2, then a third. The damage was accumulating at a rate that changed the calculation. If the Nevada sank in the channel entrance, the harbor mouth was blocked. Everything that needed to come through that channel, salvage ships, supply vessels, warships returning to base, would be blocked. The decision came down: beach her, get her out of the channel at any cost. The Nevada turned toward the shore. Her flags were still flying. I watched it happen. The massive ship, still underway, still moving with her own terrible slow momentum, turning away from the harbor entrance and heading for the shallows near Hospital Point. The smoke behind her mixed with the smoke above everything else. The guns on her decks were still firing as she went in, the crews still working through the discipline of their training, even as the ship's final act was to deliberately ground herself so that she wouldn't become a worse problem for everyone else. Someone near me started to cheer. It got about 2 words into being a cheer and then died, because the harbor was still burning and the Arizona was still producing her column of black smoke, and Henderson was still on the deck of the West Virginia, and the name I'd forgotten was still not as loud in my head as it should have been. A cheer didn't fit the acoustics of the morning. Survival, in those moments, did not feel like victory. It felt like borrowing time from something that would eventually collect. Garfield Benton was coming out of the water near the dock pilings when I found him, or he found me, which is how it actually worked, because I was the one with solid ground beneath my feet, and he was the one who had been in the harbor. He had come from the Arizona. That was clear from the oil. A complete coating from the waist down, black and heavy and smelling of the particular chemical sharpness of bunker fuel heated past its flash point. He moved through the water near the piling with the effortful deliberateness of a man whose body had been asked to do too much and was now operating on reserves it wasn't sure it had. His forearms and hands were burned, flash burns, the specific injury of thermal radiation rather than sustained fire, which strips the outer layer of skin in the instant of the event before pain has time to register, and announces itself afterward through the tight and blistering response of tissue that has absorbed more energy than it can process. He looked at me from the water. He said, "Water," not as a question, as a report. The simplest possible accounting of what he needed. I had nothing. My canteen had been lost somewhere between the deck and the dock, detached from my belt at some point I couldn't reconstruct, possibly during the run, possibly when I'd been thrown against the splinter shield, possibly in some other undocumented moment of the morning. I looked at the harbor water around us and made the assessment in approximately 1 second. Oil and fuel residue and everything that had been burned or broken in the harbor for the last 2 hours. Not drinkable under any interpretation of the word. I looked at Benton's face. He was very pale beneath the oil. Pale in the particular way of significant blood loss or significant shock, with an expression that had narrowed to the single point of his request. "Water. They have water up the hill," I said. "Aid station. We'll get you there." This was approximately true in its components. There was an aid station being assembled on the far side of the dock shed. I'd seen the canvas going up and the medical corps personnel moving with purpose in that direction, and an aid station would have water among its supplies. The walk between here and there was maybe a 1/4 mile of irregular terrain, past debris and equipment and other men in various states of needing assistance. Whether Benton could make that 1/4 mile was a calculation I ran quickly and decided in favor of attempting. I got his arm across my shoulders, his left arm, keeping the burned side of his forearms away from contact, and we started walking. He hissed at the pressure on the burns, even with the precaution, a sharp intake of breath through the teeth that he suppressed quickly, the way men suppress pain when they've decided that stopping for it would cost more than continuing. He asked about his ship twice on the walk. The first time he asked it as a question, "Is she still there?" With just enough tone of hope that I understood he knew the answer and was asking me to contradict it. The second time he asked it without the hope, flatly, as a statement that required response. "She's gone." I said I didn't know. Both times I said I didn't know, which was honest in the sense that I hadn't been close enough to see it from ground level in real time, and which was not honest in every other sense, because I had seen the fireball from the deck of the West Virginia at 0810, and the fireball was not a thing that produced the kind of question Benton was asking. We walked. His weight shifted into me more as we got further from the dock, his legs doing less of the work, or the work becoming harder to do, and I matched it, angled into it, made myself the structural element that the situation required. The concrete under our feet was covered in debris, shrapnel fragments, broken glass from something's window, a life jacket that had been cut free from something and lay deflated and empty in the most hopeless-looking way, and navigating it with another person's weight across your shoulders required more attention than I had available for thinking about anything else. The knocking behind the hatch kept coming back to me in the spaces between one step and the next. It came back unprompted, the rhythm of it. 8 knocks, pause, 8 more, slowing. precise and complete in my memory, in the way that the mind sometimes preserves the things you most need to forget. The wheel that wouldn't turn, the metal that was getting warmer, Alvarez's good hand beside mine on the spokes. The moment the knocking stopped, I'd made the right decision by going. There was no version of staying that changed the outcome, and there were men outside the hatch who needed to be moved, and who I could actually help. The math of triage is clear and cold and correct, and I knew it then and I know it now. The math being correct doesn't stop the knocking from coming back in quiet moments. At the aid station, a medic who moved with the competence of someone 3 times his visible age took Benton from me without ceremony, assessed him in 6 seconds, made 2 decisions, began acting on both simultaneously. I stepped back into the relative order of the aid station, canvas overhead, the smell of antiseptic competing with the smell of smoke, the sounds of men in pain organized into something that was being managed rather than simply endured, and I stood there for a moment with nothing to carry and nothing specific to do next. That was when my hands showed me what they had been doing without my awareness. They were shaking, not dramatically, not the tremor of visible distress, but the fine, persistent, involuntary tremor of a nervous system that had been running at emergency capacity for 2 hours and hadn't been given the signal to stop. My hands knew the morning wasn't over even if I had a moment of stillness. The body maintains its state longer than the mind needs it to. I made them hold something. A wooden crate handle, solid and rough under my fingers, and that helped. Give the hands a task, and the tremor diminishes. The body can be managed by giving it problems specific enough to absorb its excess. The second wave's last aircraft were withdrawing to the northeast. The engine sounds that had filled the morning were fragmenting, thinning, moving away in pieces rather than as a continuous presence. Some of our guns were still firing, either because the crews hadn't received the word that the wave was leaving, or because they'd decided to fire at every sky as a matter of principle going forward, which I understood and could not quite endorse. Then a lull. A real one. The sounds of the morning reduced themselves to what the morning had made. Fire, water, metal settling into new positions, men, just men, and what men sounded like when the machinery that had been hurting them withdrew long enough to let you hear the hurt itself. I sat down on the crate. Outside the canvas, across the harbor, the smoke from the Arizona rose with the patience of something that wasn't going to stop. The morning was ending. The afternoon, whatever it held, had not begun. My hands were still trembling. The worst part wasn't the noise. The worst part was the moments the noise stopped. The harbor at noon looked like a place that had been visited by something that didn't leave the way weather leaves. The sun. The same uncomplicated, indifferent sun that had been coming up pleasantly over the mountains when I'd leaned on the rail of the West Virginia with my weak coffee and my Sunday morning, was fully committed now, fully bright, throwing its ordinary December light onto everything in the harbor with the same enthusiasm it brought to everything else, and the effect of that indifference was deeply wrong. You wanted the atmosphere to confirm what had happened, to dim, to shift, to make the world around the catastrophe look like the catastrophe. Instead, it looked like Hawaii at noon, which is to say beautiful, and the beauty was an offense. I was walking along the dock by the time it became clear that the attack was finished. Not walking toward anything, walking as the body's substitute for the fact that standing in one place and thinking about the morning was not something I was ready to do yet. Keeping motion meant keeping away from the full shape of what had happened, which my mind was circling without quite landing on, the way a man circles a piece of news he can't yet read. The harbor was an inventory of damage in the particular way that inventories are difficult to make when you're standing inside them. The Arizona, below the surface, fuel still burning. The smoke column now so established that it had taken on a kind of permanence, as if it had always been there, and would mark the spot permanently, which it would. The Oklahoma, capsized, her bottom visible, men still trying to assess whether anyone inside could be reached. The West Virginia settled on the harbor floor in shallow water, her superstructure still above the surface, men working on her deck. California sinking. Nevada beached near Hospital Point, her flag still flying from her mast, still flying, which was either the most defiant or the most heartbreaking thing I had seen all morning, and I couldn't determine which. I found a position at the harbor's edge near a section of intact dock railing, and I stopped walking. Other men were doing the same thing at various positions around the harbor, finding a place to be still and looking out at what the morning had produced. There was a quality to their stillness that I recognized even though I couldn't have named it at the time. The particular bodily posture of people who are performing an accounting that hasn't finished yet. Not grief in the form that grief usually takes. Grief comes when you know the number, and the number wasn't known yet, would take days to arrive at fully, and even when it arrived it would need to be revised. Not shock, which has a kind of blankness to it, something more like recalibration, the careful process of revising a model of the world that had just been demonstrated to be insufficient. A chief petty officer I knew by reputation, 23 years in the Navy, a man who had organized his professional life around the skill of knowing what to expect, was standing about 20 feet from me, looking at the water. He was looking at it with the focused patience of a man who believed, or was trying to believe, that the water held an explanation. The water held oil and debris, and the reflection of the smoke column. The water did not comment. I walked over. We stood together without speaking. This is one of the things catastrophe produces that isn't often recorded. A sudden and very specific commonality among people who don't necessarily know each other, built from the shared orientation toward the same indigestible fact. Standing together inside the same enormous wrongness is different from any other kind of standing together. It has a weight to it, a gravity in both senses. The counting was beginning. It would take days to complete. 21 ships damaged or sunk, 188 aircraft destroyed on the ground, 2,403 Americans dead by the end of that Sunday morning. The numbers would arrive in pieces over the following days, each piece adding to a total that no one's model had contained the space for. There was no framework available in American military experience for a loss on this scale on a Sunday morning in Hawaii, because American military experience had never been built to accommodate this scenario. The framework would have to be built, and building it would take 4 years and cost a great deal more than the morning already had. Eventually, the chief petty officer spoke. He said, "They won't make that mistake twice." He meant us. He meant the American side. He meant everyone who had received information that morning and had decided to file it under probably nothing. The duty officers at Fort Shafter, the telephone operators, the intelligence analysts who had seen pieces of what was coming and arranged those pieces into a picture that was wrong. He wasn't saying it with bitterness, exactly. He was saying it the way a mechanic says something when an engine he's examined closely has failed in a way he should have caught, with the flat honesty of a professional accounting of a professional failure. I thought about Lockhart at Opana, watching the blip close on his scope, and doing everything the system gave him the authority to do, and finding the system unequal to the situation. I thought about the phone call that had clicked dead. I thought about the word probably the B-17s, probably nothing, probably friendly, and the specific mechanism by which that word had functioned as a sedative that morning, putting everyone who spoke it back to sleep inside the comfortable version of the world. Probably. The word that costs everything it touches. It is not a word of malice. That is the thing I have had to reckon with most honestly over the decades that followed December 7th. The people who said probably nothing on that Sunday morning were not negligent out of cruelty or conspiracy or even laziness. They were negligent out of the most understandable human tendency, the tendency to interpret new information in the context of existing expectations, to fit the unfamiliar into the familiar rather than revising the familiar to accommodate the unfamiliar. It is the way minds are built. It is efficient under normal conditions. It is catastrophic under the specific condition where the unfamiliar event is real. The people who received that radar signal at 072 had never lived through Pearl Harbor. They were working with models of what was possible that the morning of December 7th hadn't yet happened to. After that morning, everyone who survived it lived with models that had been updated permanently. The small boat was still working the far side of the harbor. Rescue or recovery. It was moving slowly enough that from this distance, through the smoke haze, I couldn't determine which category applied. I found that I wasn't quite ready to know, which was its own kind of information about where I was in the processing of the morning. There were things I had done. There were things I had not done. There were outcomes that were what they were, and the distinction between the ones I could have changed and the ones I couldn't was not yet clear to me, and would take a long time to become clear. What I could say, standing at the edge of the dock with the chief petty officer and the harbor stretched out before us, I had done what was possible. I had moved when moving was what was needed, and carried what could be carried, and held the wheel that wouldn't turn, and kept firing when firing was the only available option. I had not distinguished myself. I had not failed the minimum requirement of remaining present inside the worst morning I had known. Whether that would be enough for whatever came next, and something was going to come next, that was clear. The morning had not ended the war, but had started it in the fullest and most complete sense. I didn't know yet. I would find out. A sailor I hadn't met was walking past me with a folded flag held in both hands. Where it had come from and where it was going I couldn't determine, but he held it with the two-handed care of someone who understands that the object's weight is not only physical, and he walked with deliberate steps as if he had been given a specific destination and intended to reach it, regardless of what the dock between here and there looked like. I watched him go. The smoke from the Arizona rose and continued rising. The sky above the harbor had taken on the color that only large fires can produce at altitude, a brownish orange at the base of the column, darkening to black above, with the clean blue of the Pacific sky at the edges where the smoke hadn't yet reached, a border between what the morning had been and what it had made. The counting continued. The water held what it held. I made a vow standing there, in the particular way that simple vows get made. Not with ceremony, not with premeditation, but as the distillate of what the morning had been. It was not complicated. It didn't need to be. I had watched what happened when warnings were called probably nothing. I had been present in the morning that was the consequence of that calling. Whatever system I inhabited going forward, whatever position, whatever responsibility, whatever small or large authority I was ever given, I would be the part of that system that stayed on the phone. I would be the part that said the return is too large, the bearing is wrong, the speed doesn't match, something is coming, and I will say so until someone listens or until there is no longer any point in saying it. Lockhart had done that. Lockhart had done exactly that. The failure was not his, and the part of the system that failed was not a part he controlled. What he controlled was whether he tried, and he documented it, and the documentation existed as a record of a man who had performed his function correctly inside a system that hadn't been designed to take him seriously. I would be Lockhart. In whatever form that applied to my particular life, I would be Lockhart. The harbor smelled of oil and fire and salt and something else that I have since encountered only at places where large numbers of people died in a short time. A smell that is not blood exactly, and not smoke exactly, but some combination of both and more. A smell that the body recognizes before the mind does, and that produces a physical response before any thought has been formed about it. You know it when you're in it. You don't forget it after. The sky above us was ordinary and enormous and indifferent. The sky fell once. After that, we lived under it differently.